Still using the question for everybody. One of my favorite articles, I have to say, is by Franz Neumann. This is now in the 40s, but what he argued then is that there's simply no systematic evidence going either way, that federalism is either an unequivocally good thing with regard to your favorite values or an unequivocally bad thing. So it seems to me that we can all play the game at all times to show that on some occasions federalism is good with regard to what we like, and on other occasions it isn't. But that it's a fundamental error to say, unless there's really powerful social science stuff done in the last 60 years, which there might have been, that says there really are systematic things we can know about federalism with regard to its protecting liberty or denying liberty, protecting minorities or not. And it might be my own ignorance, but I'm just not familiar with that. Even though there's some very sophisticated literature on fiscal federalism. But it does seem to me that one just can't say anything very useful about the, generally federalism is good for you or bad for you with regard to things that people in the room care about. The question for all of you, and it does seem to me kind of the elephant in the room, and here I can advert back to the precedent when I was here, part of the group honoring Frank Michelman, and I wrote my piece published in Tulsa on secession, that it does seem to me that if the argument is a self-determination argument, and that's really, I think, ultimately what Heather is arguing. She doesn't write a gripping story of people who are being really oppressed by the majority, and they need this kind of help because otherwise they're going to be like the Americans in 1776 who will write of the long train of abuses. Rather, they're people who don't have the basic ability to engage in self-determination. Well, I mean, my own view is that one of the most mischievous ideas of the 20th century was Woodrow Wilson's notion of basically a universal right to self-determination, because that leads you straight into endless warfare over establishing countries of your own or city-states of your own or God knows what, where you can have the pleasure of self-determination, I agree, is a real pleasure. So it occurs to me right now there are serious secessionist movements. I mean, put Rick Perry to one side. Serious secessionist movements in Scotland. There's going to be a vote in 2014 about undoing the Treaty of Union of 1709. In Catalonia, given the current troubles in Spain, and perhaps the Basque secessionist movement will revive. There was an article in the New York Times just yesterday that Bavarians are increasingly unhappy about being part of the Federal Republic of Germany because they view themselves as being treated as a cash cow for, forget Greece, for all of the less productive parts, what Mitt Romney would call the takers rather than the makers. And of course there is Quebec. In the recent election just last month, or actually earlier this month, saw with 31% of the vote the triumph of the Parti Québécois. Now, politically, you can say they're unlikely to push, but with regard to the point about dialogue that David was talking about, one of the most interesting decisions in constitutional federalism is the Canadian court in the Quebec secession reference case that says if Quebec, or let's say Texas, really does say we'd like to leave, that the rest of the country has a duty to take this seriously and to negotiate. But it seems to me that if you focus on the virtues of self-determination, then it really is hard to avoid coming to terms with what was wrong exactly with Jefferson Davis's argument in 1860, other than the substantive value, protection of slavery, over which the South was trying to secede.
Yeah, sure. Sandy raises a lot of really interesting and important points. Let me sort of note three of them. First, on the issue of whether federalism is good or bad for minorities, if you're right and it's not systematically either good or bad, that's still a big change from the conventional wisdom, at least about American federalism, which is historically it's been bad. So if the answer is we don't know, or if the answer is it depends, that's still a substantial revision of the conventional wisdom. And if that is the answer, then that still means that sort of the case for decentralization federalism becomes stronger than it was before. Okay. And I actually think we can go further than this and say that there actually is a lot of systematic evidence from social science and economic theory and the like that in many situations voting with your feet is extremely beneficial and works better than voting at the ballot box, and to that extent that's actually systematic evidence. But even if the answer is, well, we just don't really know, that's still an important change from the dominant attitude of the last 50 or 60 years. Now, secondly, on the dramatic stories, I agree that if there's something missing from Heather's work, not there is anything, but if there was something missing, it might be the lack of sort of the dramatic stories, and looking back and reevaluating critically the history of American federalism actually does show you some of these dramatic stories. I actually told two of them in my talk. One is the story of the Mormons going to Utah to found their own state, fleeing oppression elsewhere. Secondly, the story of the African Americans moving from the South in the Great Migration to the North. These are both pretty dramatic examples that I think fit actually both casing as much or more oppressed than white Americans were in 1776. Third, the question of secession and its justification. Haven't yet written a formal article about it, so I've written many blog posts about it at the Volokh Conspiracy, and my take is that you are more right than you know when you say what was wrong with Jefferson Davis was not the idea of secession, but the reason why he wanted to secede, which of course was to protect slavery. To my mind, secession movements should be evaluated based on the cause for which they are seceding. I think that there is a good case for a presumption in favor of a right to secession. That is, if the vast majority of people in a region want to secede and they're not doing so to establish a government that's more oppressive or harmful or evil than the government that currently exists, then I think they should be allowed to do it. So I don't have if most Quebecers want to secede from Canada, most Scots from Britain and so forth. I don't think this is true of Texans, but yes, I think maybe my year that I spent in Texas has influenced me more than I know. But yes, if the vast majority of Texans want to secede and they're not likely to set up a significantly more oppressive government than already exists in the state of Texas, then they should be allowed to do it. There's a great book on this by a political philosopher named Christopher Wellman called Secession. I'm getting this wrong. It's called Secession and Self-Determination, where he makes the case for a presumptive right to secession, but subject to this restriction about setting up a more oppressive government, and in some cases subject to pre-existing obligations that you may have. So if Quebec secedes from Canada, that doesn't mean they're free of their portion of Canada's national debt. There would have to be some kind of deal worked out on that. Sure, my co-panelists have many...
Should I stand or doesn't matter?
I'm not running this thing.
I think there's a mic. You can sit. If you
okay.
If you talk loud,
I'm loud.
you can sit.
Yeah.
All right, then we're good.
You're the extrovert. So you can
Imagine you're on a game show.
So three things: two methodological and one kind of current event. It's hard to isolate the causal role of federalism because it's unclear what exactly that means. So is judicial review good? Well, do you mean abstract review, concrete review, specialized court? So if you told me something more specific, you could come up with perhaps a better model. Second methodological point, I think, really very much eludes American scholars because it's such a central part in the literature. Federalism is still the minority system of constitutional government in the world. It's more and more common, but it's much more common kind of post-World War II, but still very much a minority. There's the American system, the German system, they've influenced a lot of others, but still most systems are not typically classified as federal, so we don't have a lot of data. Third, the current situation I think is the most interesting is Catalonia, because they have a very interesting kind of fiscal federalism in the Spanish Constitution, and that could end up being a natural experiment for federalism because they changed that very dramatically after 1978, and so you could have kind of a nice kind of before and after natural experiment.
Yeah, a couple points. One on whether federalism is good or bad. Very difficult question. The only way I can think it through, I think Ilya makes some great points, although I think it doesn't change the conventional wisdom for Ilya, is the question for me would be, you know, I'm a black man post-1960 living for 200 years, and would I rather take nationalizing or localizing as an option? I think all things considered, I'm going nationalizing every single day of the week. So
throughout all those 200 years?
Next 200 years, he said.
Excuse me?
He said the next 200 years.
The next 200 years.
No, the previous.
The previous.
Right? I mean, that's, so if I'm thinking about it that way.
Even if it means nationwide slavery in 1780.
Well,
nationwide Jim Crow in 1900.
You think that's what that would mean. I think that is under the, not nationalizing in terms of nationalizing all the rules, but am I better off under the federal government? Is federalism better off under the federal government or the states, right? Sort of like all things considered, without rigorous social scientific methodology. My guess is, overall, my judgment at the end of, in 1960, my judgment would be, yeah, overall, the federal government did better by us than the states.
Which states?
Yeah.
Well,
where you are.
those are all great questions, right? But that's you can't answer that question from the way that we're trying to set it up, right? From Sandy's question, which is how do you determine whether federalism is better off overall through that time period? And my best guess is, look, if what Ilya wants to do is count and to say, look, in this period it was good, in that period it was bad, in this period it was good, in that period it was bad. All right, if your overall running tally, my guess is overall running tally for me would be federal government over states. So, which would reaffirm generally the conventional wisdom, notwithstanding the thoughtfulness that you brought into it to help us think about, look, you can't think about this as a unitary history without taking into account some of the historical contingencies over different periods of time. All right, so, okay. So on the Sandy's point, and I take your question, Sandy, to mean that does conceiving of this in terms of self-determination further or lead to secessionary movements and possibilities, not just about secession, but really the argument about self-determination itself. And I think, so conceiving it that way really problematizes the whole, as you meant to do, problematizes the whole enterprise, right? Because if the point is we are fomenting dissension where there would not otherwise be, right? By conceptualizing a fundamental right to self-determination, you know, I think that's a very powerful question. It does mean that in certain circumstances, that if the underlying need for self-determination shall independently arise, there's nothing that we can do about it. But I don't think one can blithely say that self-determination is in and of itself a good without thinking about the various contexts to which it would lead. So that's why I think that has to give one pause I can't simply say, well, self-determination is going to lead secession. I don't have a problem with it, because I think those things are interrelated. And if you're designing a system and you're trying to design one that holds together, you ought to think about what are the circumstances that are going to lead it to fall apart.
Heather may be a bomb thrower after all.
Just one other quick thing. Another way in which American federalism is quite different goes back to Ilya's point about Quebec, is our Constitution doesn't state that different states are going to be treated differently, right? You can politically, you know, and under spending clause or other things, enter into different arrangements, but, you know, commandeering technically as a matter of doctrine applies to Arizona and New York. And so it's not just where do you live, but it's also how does the constitutional federalism apply to where you live, and it could be different for different places. So.
Many countries have asymmetrical federalism.
Right.
We actually have a little bit also with Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and the like, but we have much less of it than others do.
I have another question here too.
David Fontana.
Thank you, David Schleicher.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Two Davids have to stick together.
Or part in this case. So your theory of the effective dialogue on creativity elsewhere has an idea that the main connections between state policymakers and federal policymakers will be formal. That it's when they're called to account they will give their explanations, and that's when their discussions or dialogue will happen. This strikes me as not necessarily right, and maybe you're shaking your head so you agree with that it's not necessarily right, in the sense that there are a lot of other things that affect the amount of, if the question is oversight or interaction. So let me go through a couple. Distance from the center, right? Such that the extent that state policymakers are close to the state of national media. So, for instance, in a world with national media, we might imagine more or less covering of what state policymakers do at the national level. So the question is, do the formal rules of federalism matter all that much? And so, of course, the other one I'd say would be state political parties. In terms of, I mean, this is going to be a somewhat immeasurable question, the amount of actual day-to-day connection. Because the connection between, the dialogue between states and the federal government, you're using metaphors from Bell Laboratories, but that's, of course, people. And we're trying to figure out, the states are, as much as Texans may disagree, are not, do not have individual characters. They're,
They, not net.
What?
Dignity.
Yes, right, dignity.
They're a they, not net.
They're they, not net. And so the idea here is, like, how much can we leverage the discussion, the kind of literature on what makes people creative through individual relationships creative? And the second question would be, how much do the formal rules matter?
So on the first one, I didn't mean, and if I said I shouldn't have said that there's a particular form of psychological distance that's more important, like a formal meeting. It was an example, right? So it could be, psychological distance can be temporal, right? It could be, I have a very different attitude towards something that happened 100 years ago and 10 minutes ago. It can be spatial, California, this is the policy diffusion literature, closer you are, the more the innovation spread, right? And even, state to state, it could be I went to law school with somebody. It could be I read the newspaper in that state, right? They're all forms of things that can make something more or less distant. I don't mean to privilege a particular type. So on the formal structures of federalism, right, I guess my instinct would be they matter only to the extent that they're actually compelling or inducing certain types of interaction, right? So if there is a constitutional due process, procedural due process right, for a state to meet with the federal government before the federal government can preempt them, then that's the kind, that right's abided by and enforceable, however, then that might actually matter quite a bit, right? But, the actual, most of these times, this is Adrian Vermeule's thing about, dormant powers, right? A lot of these times in constitutions, these are lists of constitutional mays, but not constitutional musts. And so the politics really works in the interstices for most of these things. So.
I have a question for my students.
A lot of the conversation today has defined, we've been talking about federalism in terms of center versus periphery, but the examples historically, I think by necessity, have been localized. So a central location versus a peripheral location. But the world is becoming such, and it's going to continue to become more so, that so much political organization and action is translocal. Do we have a concept of federalism, first of all, that can account for not only center and periphery, but also categories of action that don't really fit neatly into either one of those? And does translocalization of interests become a tool for dissent, or does it militate against the idea of dissent altogether, because you're no longer talking about electoral majorities and minorities in particular locations, but a real multivocal conversation about interests that aren't about a minority dissenting against a majority?
Ellie, you started first the last time.
Fools rush in where wise men fear to tread. So I'll try to take that on. A lot depends on what you mean by translocal, because that term means several different things in the discourse on this stuff. But what I would say is that much of what I said about federalism all the way down, much of what Heather said actually applies here, in that if you push federalism towards greater decentralization with local governments, private organizations, or private planned communities and like playing a bigger role, you can have a wider range of groups engaging in different kinds of experimentation and also competing with each other for residents, or in the case of planned communities, customers and the like. And so you can have more flexible forms, and also There's some scholars say, well, with globalization and movement, because people don't have as much of a fixed identity that's tied to locality, federalism is less valuable. I think when you look at it from terms of voting with your feet, it becomes more valuable, because in a society where people are more mobile and where they have interests in common with a wider range of people in other places, that makes it actually more feasible for them to vote with their feet effectively than they would in the past. So here is actually another way where voting with your feet becomes a more important part of the picture. If it was important for African Americans in the Jim Crow South 100 years ago, or European immigrants to the U.S. In the 19th century, it's actually a bigger potential advantage for people today. In my NOMO started, I mentioned actually, in addition to pushing federalism all the way down, I tried to push it all the way up and suggest that this strengthens the case for freer international migration, precisely for this reason, among others.
It could be, and so we have first and second order, we could have third order diversity now. This could be a new thing, right?
Fourth and fifth.
Fourth and fifth, yeah. I think one way of viewing, we've talked a lot about federalism in this panel, but one way of viewing this is kind of a portable framework of organizational diversity, right? Federalism is a case study, a constitutional case study, but it could apply to all sorts of different situations. It's ways of organizing diversity. It could be racial, ethnic, political, who uses the internet a lot or doesn't, right? It's kind of a way of organizing diversity, however diversity is defined. Yeah.
I very much agree with that. I mean, these are questions of institutional design, right? So what are the purposes of institutions? How do you design them to achieve certain types of purposes? What is our best guess about how they're going to work and the interactions that they're going to produce? So why is it that we might care a lot more about a subnational entity as opposed to a very local entity, or care more about a national entity as opposed to other types of regional entities? What are the incentive structures in terms of how institutions are designed that enable different types of participation? So I think of them in those terms you mentioned more as fundamentally institutional design questions and incentive structures and potential outcomes and best guesses, empirically informed and hunches about what we know at all of those levels.
We have time for just one last question. I think Professor Piatti had a question.
Well, a question then, I guess a comment to Yulia. I mean, I thought your observation about federal power perhaps left out the significant limitations that recently been introduced via the First Amendment. But with respect to the voting with your feet, it almost seems like what you're saying is you're giving up on democracy itself, like the franchise as the mechanism for the governance, because we know that there isn't like frictionless. You can't just move anywhere, even if you would like to move anywhere, and that labor mobility has some real limitations. So that's a significant cost that maybe that you might want to say, I'm here, this is the place I am, that I don't want to give up on the franchise as the
So what I would say is, and I expound this much more fully in my book on political ignorance, is not that I want to give up on a franchise entirely, but that I want to have a relatively bigger role for voting with your feet and a relatively smaller role than many other people would assign to voting at the ballot box. But that's not to say that nothing would be decided at the ballot box. Rather, what I would suggest is that voting with your feet has these very important informational advantages and also some other advantages that I mentioned. Now, are there cases where those advantages are outweighed by disadvantages? Of course there are. That's why it's not my claim that democracy should be abolished entirely, but it is my claim that the conventional picture of democracy and federalism overestimates the role that's appropriate for ballot box voting and underestimates foot voting. And it should be a bigger part of our theory of democracy and self-governance.
What is the incentive structure once you've abolished democracy for there to be responsive to foot voting?
So,
isn't the whole point that, look, you need a big ballot box because...
So there are several incentives, but one of the most obvious ones is state governments and local governments want revenues. When foot voters leave or don't come in the first place, their revenue diminishes.
But we also worry about corruption, and one of the mechanisms of dealing with that is theoretically the ballot box.
It isn't. Foot voting helps with a lot too, because a jurisdiction which is highly corrupt is a jurisdiction which tend to provide worse public services, at least to those who are not the ones paying the bribes, and therefore there's actually evidence that in federal systems where there's a lot of intra-jurisdictional competition, corruption goes down as a result. Some political. If you send me an email, I'll send you some useful sentences.
I'm going to ask Mr. Turner to close this session now. Please return about a little bit before 3:30. Our next session will start at 3:30, and we will be honored with Mr. Heather.